For the second half of Unit 1, we'll be working on a project which will be the investigation of the properties of the elements. In this project, you will use the periodic table as a model to predict properties of the elements, plan and carry out an investigation of the properties of the elements, and you'll develop mathematical models to answer a research question. The parts of the project will include first a collaborative presentation about a group or family or category of elements from the periodic table. You will include the name of the family, group, or category, the location on the periodic table, chemical and physical properties the elements have in common, uses for some of the elements, and pictures of elements in this family, group, or category. That part of the project we'll do at the end, and it will be a very small portion of your grade. The larger portion of your grade will be based on your individual investigation of the properties of the elements in the particular family, group, or category that you've chosen. So for that summative investigation, you're required to include all the parts of an investigation that I'll show on the next slide. And individuals will be writing their own investigation report on Google Docs. So for the investigation part of the project, you will start with a research question. You'll develop a hypothesis. You'll run an experiment or do some research to collect data. You'll graph and model the data, and then you'll write a conclusion about the pattern that you see in the data that includes claim supported by evidence with some reasoning. So the rest of the slideshow will lead you through the lessons on the parts of an investigation. You'll read the slides, watch the videos if there are any, and fill in the blanks or answer questions as you go. For the most part, you'll just be using this video as your slideshow. So the learning targets covered in this particular lesson are: I can develop a testable research question using measurable variables. I can develop and explain a testable hypothesis using scientific principles. I can develop and use graphical models to interpret quantitative data, and I can use appropriate statistical terms to interpret data and use it as evidence for a claim. So basically, we are working on what the next generation science standards say are the really most important practices that scientists do every day. So in class, we're going to do those practices so you understand what they are and you start working on the skills that scientists use rather than just listen to me talk about them. So these are the 8 practices identified by the next generation science standards that scientists use every day. So during this project, you'll be working on asking questions, developing and using models, planning and carrying out investigations, using mathematics and computational thinking, and engaging in argument from evidence. So these will be actual skills that scientists use every day that you'll be using in class after you learn the proper way to do them. So the first part of today's lesson is all about asking a testable question. So the reason scientists ask questions, or the reason scientists ask questions is questions arise from careful observations of phenomena or unexpected results. Or you might have a question that you need to clarify and you're seeking more information. Research questions arise from examining models or a theory, and you want to clarify or seek a different additional information about that particular theory. Questions arise that lead you through the process of trying to understand and determine relationships between variables. You might want to clarify and refine a model, an explanation, or an engineering problem. Scientists ask questions that can be investigated within the scope of the laboratory, research facilities, or field with available resources. They ask questions that challenge the premise of an argument in the interpretation of a data set or the suitability of a design. And scientists ask questions to define a design problem that involves the development of a process or a system with interacting components. Scientists also evaluate questions to determine if they're testable and relevant. I have a picture of Dmitry Mendeleev here because we have learned about the process that he used to come up with what is known today as the periodic law. So Mendeleev's process was the same as I have described here. He observed a phenomenon, which was the patterns in the properties of the elements. He asked a testable question. Is there a relationship between the atomic mass and the properties of these elements? He collected and organized the data. Basically, he wrote the element names on cards and wrote down all the information he knew about them. Then he moved the cards around until he could see some patterns and/or relationships in the data. He started to develop a model where he was illustrating the relationships he was seeing, which was, as you put the elements in order of atomic mass, you start to see repeated patterns of properties. This became the periodic law and what is known as the periodic table. He wrote an argument providing evidence for the model. So basically, he was in the process of writing a textbook, and he put the periodic law in the textbook and supported it with evidence. Otherwise, we wouldn't be studying it today. He made predictions using his model, which was he predicted that there were some elements that hadn't been discovered yet, and he left blanks for them, and he even predicted their properties. And then he took his model and added new information to it to see if it still worked. So he added another whole group of elements, the noble gases in the end, and they actually did fit on the end of the periodic table. So he actually went through the scientific process that you are about to go through. So we, in this particular lesson on today, we are working on just 2 learning targets. We want you to be able to develop a testable research question using measurable variables by the end of this lesson, and develop and use graphical models, basically graphs, to interpret the data that you collect as a result of asking that research question. These are learning targets 6 and 8 for Unit 1. So you're going to write your own research question, and it needs to be testable and relevant. So what makes a research question testable and what makes it relevant? So it's testable if it contains variables or factors that can be measured or tallies. In this case, the properties of the elements. So atomic mass is an example. Reactivity, density, melting and boiling points, all of those properties that we've been learning about and talking about, those are all measurable, and those are variables that will be a part of your question. A testable question requires a set of data, not just one data point to provide an answer, because basically you're looking for patterns in the data. So you need many elements. You need lots of properties from those elements. One element is not enough to see a pattern. Also, your research question needs to be relevant. It needs to be focused on one phenomenon or problem. Just like Mendeleev focused on atomic mass, he put the elements in order of atomic mass and looked for patterns and other properties. He connected a larger essential question or science concept to his work, which was, is there an organizing principle to all matter? And that's the same question that you're thinking about. What are you seeing for patterns within your group of elements? Based on an authentic experience or observation. So Mendeleev based his questions that he was using to run his experiments on the fact that he observed elements. Some elements have very similar properties. And so he was trying to make sense of that. That was an authentic problem that he was trying to solve. So when you write your research question for your investigation of your group of elements on the periodic table, you want to make sure it is testable and it is relevant. You'll be using some references in your notebook to help guide your work. First is the graph choice chart. You have this in your notebook. It's probably somewhere, maybe on page 5 or 8 or somewhere in that vicinity. On the left-hand side are the types of research questions, and as you read left to right, you answer some questions, and this helps you figure out what kind of graph is appropriate to answer the research question that you wrote. So you will write a research question that will probably fit into one of these categories, and then you will need to figure out what kind of graph is good for graphing the data that you collect to answer that question. You will also use the graphing tips reference. This is very helpful in guiding you through the process of setting up your graph once you have your data. So again, on the left-hand side, we have the different types of research questions that you can ask. And as you read left to right, you are viewing the different types of graphs that would be good for your data if you are asking a particular type of question. And then this also shows you how to set up the graph, so what to put on the x-axis, what to put on the y-axis, if anything. And then make sure you use this checklist such that you have all the parts of the graph included. So basically, when you write your research question for your investigation, it's going to fall into one of these categories. It will either be a variability question, a comparison, a correlation, a time series, or a proportion. Basically, all questions asked in science that drive experiments fall into one of these 5 categories. A variability question has one variable that is being studied or across one group or population. A comparison question basically has one variable that's being measured and it's being compared across several different groups. A correlation question is looking for a relationship between 2 numeric variables. A time series question is asking how a variable changes over time. And then a proportion question asks how a whole group of things is proportioned out among several smaller groups, populations, categories, or subgroups. I'm going to go through each of the examples one by one. And as I do, I'm going to ask you to write some example questions for each category and sketch out some graphs that might work for that type of question. So the first question is a variability question. Again, it has one variable and it has one group or population in it. So an example is, how does density vary across the metallic elements? So density is the variable that can be measured or researched. And you're asking about this particular group of elements, the metallic elements. So basically, there's this format that we can follow to write a good research question. And if you want, what you need to do is write down 3 variability questions in your notebook. You're going to write down what a variability question has for format, describe the format, write down my example, and then use these variables down here and these groups to fill in the blank. And write down these 3 questions in your notebook that you come up with. So for example, you might put this variable of melting point into this question right here, and you might ask about the metals as a group. So your research question would be, how does melting point vary across the metals? And then choose a different variable in a different group or the same group, and so on until you have 3 questions that are great examples of variability questions. They will all have a variable that can be measured and a group or population that you'd be studying. If you want to do that right now, go ahead and pause the video and you can write your example questions, and you can write down the description of a variability question and my example as well. When you graph variability data, you have 3 types of graphs that are appropriate. One of them is a dot plot. And I've covered up the title of this and the label on the x-axis just because I want you to think about plugging in variables and groups from down here into the title and the x-axis. So you could use a dot plot, which is a type of frequency plot. You could use a box and whisker, which takes the same kind of data and maps it across this x-axis with the whiskers showing the maximum and the minimum data. And then the line in the middle is the median. And then this box right here is the middle 50% of the data. And then this is a histogram, which basically is very similar to a dot plot, only it uses what we call buckets. So a range right here. So what this is saying is there are it's 6 times storms had a wind speed between 30 and 45 knots. And then here, like 7 or 8 times out of all of the storms, the maximum wind speed were between 46 and 60. So a histogram is basically a dot plot, only instead of using individual numbers, it uses ranges of numbers to plot the frequency. So either way, all of these graphs are appropriate for graphing the data that you collect from asking a variability question. So if I were to use a dot plot, on the x-axis, I would put my variable, which is melting point. So this would be all the melting points across here. And then for my title, I would probably call this melting points of metallic elements. And then each little mark, each little X is an element and its melting point. So you can pause the video right now and you can sketch out how you would set up a dot plot, a box and whisker, or a histogram for one of your research questions that you wrote, one of your variability questions. I'm not looking for any numbers or anything to be in there, just write out a x-axis and what you would label it and what you would title it. If you want to sketch in pretend numbers and data, you can do that as well, but you don't have to. I just want you to be familiar with how you might set up one of these graphs. So another type of testable question is a comparison question, and basically it takes one variable and compares it across 2 or more groups. So my example is, how do the melting points of metals compare to those of nonmetals? So I have melting point as my variable, and the 2 groups are metals versus nonmetals. So here are your variables to choose from. You need to write 3 comparison questions about these groups right here. So please plug in a variable, plug in 2 groups, and that's basically how you write a comparison question. When you get ready to do your investigation, maybe you'll decide to do a comparison question. Write these down in your notebook, write down the description of the format of a comparison question and my example. For graphing comparison data, you can do multiple frequency plots. So you would still have your x-axis with your variable on it, and then you would put your groups over here. So this would be, for my example question, how does the atomic radius compare between metals and nonmetals? I'd have my atomic radius here on the x-axis, and then I'd have metals and nonmetals, and I'd have a little box and whisker for both of them. So you could compare the 2 groups in terms of their atomic radii. Sometimes you don't want to look at all of the data, the whole spread of data, the maximum, the minimum, the median, and the middle 50% of the data. You want to look at just one number that represents each group. So a lot of times that's an average. Sometimes it's a maximum or a minimum, maybe even a range. In this case, I might do an average atomic radius. So I'd put atomic radius here on the y-axis, and then I would do the average atomic radius for metals, the average atomic radius for nonmetals, and then we would be able to compare very clearly and visually on average which group has a larger atomic radius. So please choose one of your questions that you wrote, one of your comparison questions, and just sketch out what a graph might look like. What would you put on the x-axis? What would you put on the y-axis? If you want to throw in some pretend data, you can. Correlation questions, they show a relationship between 2 variables. So I have a couple of ways of wording them here. So one is the atomic mass related to the atomic radius? So atomic mass is one of the variables, radius is the other variable, and I'm looking to see if there's any sort of relationship between the 2 of them. Another way to say that is, does the atomic mass influence or affect the atomic radius? So there, I would like you to write down the format, the example, and then I want you to write 3 of your own example questions in your notebook. You have some variables to choose from. You would put 2 variables in each question. So you might say, is the atomic radius related to the boiling point? If you need to be more specific, you could say, is the atomic radius related to the boiling point of metals? If you wanted to just narrow down your focus. Correlation questions are best answered using a scatter plot. A scatter plot has the independent variable, which is usually written first in your question. They have the independent variable on the x-axis, the dependent variable on the y-axis. So my example question here is the solubility, which is the independent variable, related to the density, which is the dependent variable written second. So solubility would go on the x-axis, density would go on the y-axis. I would plot my points, and then I would use a line of best fit to see if there was a relationship there that could be illustrated by a line, a trend line, or a line of best fit. So I want you to choose one of your 3 questions and just sketch out how you might set up a scatter plot with a variable on the x and a variable on the y. Give it a title. If you want to throw in some pretend data, feel free, and a trend line. It's just so that you have your own example of how you might set up a graph. So when you do your own investigation, you will have notes to look at. A time series question. A time series question is a type of correlation question, but it's asking about time. Time is the independent variable. It will always go on the x-axis. So basically, a time series question asks how one variable changes over a time period. An example would be, how does the reactivity of a substance to oxygen change over a 24-hour period? So I have my variable, and I have the time period I'm measuring that variable in. Please write down the description of what a time series question is and my example, and then drag some variables into the question. Write 3 questions. You can determine the amount of time you want to run your experiment over, but every single one needs to have a time period that you're using to measure that variable. To graph a time series data, you are using a scatter plot, but you use it differently. Instead, you connect the points because you're interested in looking at the fluctuations over time. So you really want to see the ups and downs in the data. Whereas in a true correlation, you're looking for a relationship between the 2 variables, so you use a trend line. A line graph is different. The purpose is to look at the ups and downs, so you connect the dots. So my question would be, how does the abundance in Earth's crust change over 1 million years? So I would put the abundance in the Earth's crust on the y-axis, and then I would put 1 million years across my x-axis. And then I would connect the points. Once I plotted my points, I would connect them so I had a line to look at and I could see the fluctuations in the data. So I want you to choose one of your questions, and I want you to sketch how you would set up the graph. Again, you can throw in some fake data if you want to put some points in and connect the dots. Finally, we have proportion questions. A proportion question asks how one whole group is proportioned out among several groups, populations, or subcategories. So what is the percentage of elements that are solids, liquids, and gases at room temperature? So the whole group is all of the elements on the periodic table, and then we would be asking about what percentages are made up of these different states. So I would like you to write down in your notebook 3 different examples of proportion questions. I've given you some categories to work with and some whole groups to work with. Once you have that done, I would like you to sketch either a pie chart or a stacked bar chart showing how the whole is proportioned into groups. So if I were doing what percentage of elements are solids, liquids, or gases at room temperature, the whole circle or the whole bar would represent all of the elements, and then I would create a percentage for solids, for liquids, and for gases, and color those in my pie chart. For a stacked bar, you're putting the percentage on the y-axis, and then you're using different sections of the bar, different proportion sections of the bar to represent your different percentages. So the green here might be solids, and then we have gases in yellow, and then we have liquids in orange. So it's the same visual, only in this one is in the form of a rectangle, and this one is in the form of a circle. Please sketch out your own example for one of your research questions related to proportion data. So we're officially done with this lesson about writing some testable research questions, and there are 5 different types, and then thinking about what type of graph would be appropriate for the data that you would need to answer that research question. The next lesson in line will be a lesson about writing developing and explaining a testable hypothesis using scientific principles. But we are done for now. We will use the information that you've learned in this mini lesson to write your own research question and think about the data that you would collect in your experiment.